Hello, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. Nice to see you as always. Okay, we'll cover off introductions very quickly. I'm sure you're going to have a few more joining us, but let's get things underway. Let's go to Kim Schweitzer, please. First of all, to introduce herself nice and briefly. Thank you.
Hi all, I'm Kim Schweitzer. I'm an ambassador and volunteer with TTF, and I'm a founder of Time for Change London. We work with organizations that genuinely believe that people, planet, and profit are all important in creating a great company culture, but don't have the time, energy, or expertise to focus on the people part.
Lovely. That's a really good elevator pitch you've got there, Kim. Thank you very much. Mr. Nigel Cairns. I've always meant to tell you this. I really do love your ceiling, Nigel. It's a gorgeous ceiling.
Well, it's only half finished, actually. If you look on one side, it's sort of painted different to the other side. So
I can't really
luckily you haven't picked that one up. Anyway, Nigel, good evening, everybody. And Nigel Cairns calling in from Devon. I'm involved in a long-term banking dispute as the origins of my interest in TTF. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. Let's now go to Mr. Tom Levitt, who's going to introduce himself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Tom Levitt. I'm the author of a book called The Company Citizen, and also The Courage to Meddle, which is a book about Frances Perkins, who's slightly relevant to today's discussion because she was the American who brought in the New Deal under FDR. I was in government and I was a school teacher in my first career. I was a very junior member of the Labour government for 13 years. And since then, I've been working with business as a force for good on many different fronts.
Wonderful to have you with us, Tom. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Andrea. If I can see Andrea's a passenger being driven along right now, so hopefully you can still speak, Andrea. Please introduce yourself, Andrea, if you can.
I'm really not very good at this, and you're not coming through very well. I don't think I've got very good signal. But by the by, I'm Andrea Willows. I'm one of the RBS GRG banking victims, or shall I say survivors, really, because I've kind of picked myself up, dusted myself off, and trying to crack on with things while still trying to fight the bank. So yeah, looking forward to see this film tonight, though.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrea. Thank you. Let's now go to Gareth Samra.
Good evening, all. I'm a member of the Clydesdale Yorkshire Bank Group victims group, and yeah, I'm not very happy about the way things have gone in the financial services. So I'm trying to do as much as I can on all fronts, and hopefully to be able to make the change along with everybody else.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm especially pleased to introduce, or rather to invite Jacob to introduce himself. Jacob, we've known each other for less than 24 hours by email. Really pleased that you're here. Please tell everybody about yourself and your relationship between yourself and this documentary that we've watched. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm the director of the film. I made this and another film with Professor Reich called Inequality for All, which I sort of recommend you watch as follow-up homework to this film. That was a film that very much put the issue of widening economic inequality on the political map here in America anyway, and I think had some good play over there in the UK as well. Anyway, I got this invitation, late last night. I happened to be working on a film about technology at this point that has to do with some related issues around streaming platforms and some of the associated economic issues, and I was very interested to hear about this film discussion, particularly to get some sense of what's happening around people's thinking of this in the UK, because it's outside of my everyday sphere of like the opinions that I hear. So anyway, I'm mostly interested in listening to what everybody has to say on this call and listening into the discussion. I'll probably be on mute for a lot of it, but thank you for inviting me and for pulling this together. And I look forward to learning from all of you.
Jacob, thanks very much. We're proud to say you're the second producer we've had to one of our film clubs. We had Joel Bacard, who made The Corporation. Do you know Joel, or do you know of his work at all?
Sure, I love that film. It had a big impact on me, and I'm you know, referencing it from time to time as you know, how to handle storytelling around some of these issues. So I don't know him personally, but I'm a fan.
Yeah, we're definitely fans, and he's been with us a couple of times on occasions like this. In fact, the last session we had with Joel was just last Monday, because he's suing Twitter because Twitter are trying to censor his film and stop publicity around it. Really interesting stuff. More about that later on. Let's go to Mr. Robert Ashford. Robert, lovely to see you. Please introduce yourself, Robert. Thank you.
Oh, my name is Robert Ashford. I teach at Syracuse University, and I'm a great fan of Andy's great work. Very interested in improving capitalism.
Very interesting. Robert's got a session with us on Wednesday, 6 p.m. UK time, all about Robert Ashford's inclusive capitalism. So I'm really pleased Robert's here as well. Robert's going to be speaking along with, I think, 2 or maybe even 3 other US academic economists as well. Okay, I've left Gareth to last for a reason, because Gareth is our volunteer head of events, and Gareth's going to introduce himself and then run through a few slides, I guess, just to give his thoughts about the film, and then we'll open it up and everyone can get a chance to share what they say. I really do like this film. It does remind me of The New Corporation, and the follow-up sequel to that is of the same kind of genre, and it really did make me stop and think about just how captured our democratic process is. That to me seems to be the heart of the problem. We have a democracy that's not really serving the people as it's intended to. But those are my kind of opening remarks. Let's go to Gareth now, who'll introduce himself and perhaps use a slide or 2 to help convey his thoughts about the film. Thank you, Gareth.
Thanks, Andy. I will bring up some slides in a second. Just very briefly, who I am. I'm a pension professional or a pension consultant by trade. I came across the Transparency Task Force because of the excellent work it does helping people who've been victims of pension scams, something that interests me in my day job. But I'm also a film buff. I studied film at university before entering the pensions industry. And I think Andy, discovering this, thought I would be good head of the film club. So I don't have a great deal of slides. I'm not trying to hog the proceedings. I'm much more interested in what other people have to say. But the film Saving Capitalism, hopefully you've all seen it or at least made it. But if you haven't, then it's still worth staying in the discussion. We'll get you up to speed in no time at all. Just a brief explainer here. This is from IMDb, so apologies, Jacob. I'm not trying to give away half the credit. That is what IMDb says, who IMDb says directed it. Release date 2017. There's a brief synopsis there. If you've not seen it, have a quick read. If you have, that's not going to tell you anything you don't already know. And I just thought it'd be worth saying a bit about Robert Reich, because he obviously dominates the film. Strikes me as a very impressive and likable gentleman. So 75 years old, still seems to be in fine fettle. Bit of a polymath, I think is the term for it. He's an economist, professor, author, and everything you can see there. Has been involved in 4 different governments, I think, right? 4 different presidencies, by my counting, whilst also being a chancellor professor at UC Berkeley. Had a bit of a year in 2008. He was voted in the top 10 best cabinet members of the century in the US, and the 6th most influential business thinker by the Wall Street Journal, all in the same year. And this is all on top of publishing 18 books, including Saving Capitalism. So this is a film essentially about the book, as I understand it. Any of this wrong, of course, Jacob, you'll have a right of reply shortly. I just thought, rather than sort of having lots and lots of slides. I just thought I'd put these up there as sort of potential discussion points if people didn't have any they wanted to raise themselves. I'll close this in a second though, so just sort of make a mental note if there's any of these that you really want to get talking about.
Gareth, if you can, could you copy paste that slide and whack it into the chat so when we're having a chat we can still refer to those questions?
That's a very good idea. Okay,
thank you,
I'll
Gareth.
do that then. I'll stop sharing. I suppose the last thing left for me to do is to say, yeah, I very much enjoyed the film. Jacob, thank you very much. I thought in particular, I mean, as you could tell from the slide, I was very impressed by Robert Reich, who I've heard him on podcasts before. I listened to the Bill Mayer podcast. I don't know if you know it. He seems to be a frequent guest on that. But yeah, he's someone who just sort of increasingly impresses me, but also gives me some hope as well. There are sort of people, very smart people out there who are not afraid to cross the divide. And that I thought was very impressive. In the UK, to be honest, I see sort of some Americans perhaps on the right of the spectrum. I find them quite intimidating, to be honest with you, all the way over the Atlantic. And it does seem to be, you know, not being an expert, but, you know, America seems to have some problems with political division. And that's probably an understatement. And I was just really very impressed with the way he was happy to cross the divide and talk to people from the other side of the spectrum, obviously being a man of the left himself. So that was probably my biggest takeaway. But I think now it's probably about time for me to open up to the floor and give other people an opportunity to speak.
Gareth, thank you very much indeed. Appreciate your preparation and your management of these sessions as always. I'm just going to throw a few figures in that came out of the documentary for me, which I thought were absolutely staggering. And these are numbers that are really significant. The first one I want to draw your attention to, and I think I've written this down right. If I've got it wrong, forgive me. But in 1964, 77% of Americans trusted the government. And that kind of feels about right. You think all the way back to the early 60s, 1964, 77% of the American public trusted the government. And it's now about 20%. You know, those two numbers in themselves tell one hell of a big story, don't they? You know, they really do tell one hell of a big story. A lot of you will know that we published a book last year called, here's our book, Why We Must Rebuild Transparency and Trustworthiness in Financial Services. So a lot of the Transparency Task Force kind of time and energy is spent on trying to understand why it is that trust levels in the financial services sector in particular are so low. And it's remarkable to see 77% in 64 down to 20% today. And you know, how low can it go? I mean, there's got to come a point where the trust levels become so low that people are just unwilling to accept the kind of integrity of the system. In fact, the whole documentary started off with the phrase, the system is rigged. There must come a point when, if so many people feel the system is rigged, that we end up with real kind of flashpoints. A couple of other numbers here. Again, I think I wrote it down right. Forgive me if I've got it wrong. I think in the early 70s, 3% of politicians went into lobbying afterwards, and that's now 42%. I mean, my goodness me, and you have to ask yourself, well, if there's like an almost 1 in 2 chance that the politician who you're electing is going to seek a career as a lobbyist after he or she's elected, to what extent can you be confident that that won't in any way affect their thinking whilst they're in office? You know, let's be real about it. It's kind of almost bound to. And the way the numbers worked out, the average amount spent, if you divide up all the amount of money spent on lobbying divided by the amount of politicians, it's like just under it's 5.9 million pounds a head. It's like a grotesque figure, a really grotesque figure. So I thought
dollars, Andy.
Dollars. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Of course. So I thought I would just mention those figures to kind of help get us on our way. Gareth, thank you very much. Jacob, would you like to say anything first of all? Of course, we'd be delighted to hear you. It's a real treat for us to have the movie's producer with us. And please say whatever you like. There's no kind of fixed agenda here. It's a very informal conversation. You've probably got a bit of a feel for what the Transparency Task Force is all about. We're basically all about trying to make the financial industry behave properly. So feel free to say what you like to Jacob, and then we'll go to others who like to share their thoughts about the film as well. Thanks, Jacob.
Well, just a few thoughts. Firstly, has anybody on this call seen Inequality for All? Is that if not, that's sort of a surprise. Normally, that's the first one, and this is the second one in the series of people's entry points. So I suggest maybe giving that a look if you're looking for a film recommendation. But yeah, this sort of connection between the problems going on within, or the inequalities rising, sort of snowballing into power imbalances that sort of affect the political system, was very much at the heart of why I wanted to make the film. And you put a question, Gareth, in the suggested topics. One is about, is there such a thing as a free market? And the big aha for me in terms of, I'm not an economist. I'm a filmmaker. But I've been thinking for a long time about, what how would we orchestrate a society, to sort of what's a good society, and the question of widening economic inequality very much ties, weaves its way through the question of power of a political system for me, and sort of makes it so that question that you were just raising, Andy, about like that trust in government, are those two things connected? Are the problems that have happened within the sort of growing imbalance of money and power, do those spill over into those trust in government numbers that you mentioned from the 1960s to today? And sort of a growing suspicion that the question of the game being rigged, the question of the sense that when people feel essentially powerless, there's another sort of quote or stat in the film where he says, the interests of the vast majority of people are statistically insignificant when it comes to like what policies are enacted in government. So as we've seen the economy sort of start to widen, or the economic imbalances start to widen, we've seen these sort of attendant consequences to the political system. And like you said, at what point do people just stop feeling like the system is viable for them and start like essentially like throwing up their hands and saying, let's scrap the whole thing? And that's really my fear for what's happening, politically, in America to a certain extent, is that, these questions, these economic questions are tied into the political questions, and that there may be that this question of the essential myth of the free market, that there is one, that people continue to use that language, that we're not all just architecting a system where somebody's making the rules. That seems to be like, if I had an origin story for where it all sprung from, that would be the kind of the big one, is like, I think even on the left, we've sort of, and at least in America, sort of taken that language and sort of internalized it in a way that I feel like has been really corrosive to any kind of meaningful discussion of solutions. So from my perspective, that language is the sort of founding myth upon which all the rest of the kind of trouble is built. So, I'm giving away my opinion, and, I'm interested in this discussion going forward, but I think that's probably in a weird way, it hasn't been as big of a takeaway from the film for viewers as I sort of thought it was for me in the making, if that makes sense. I thought that like the takeaway of like how we architect a system being like the entire story, that we're making a system up with rules that, depending on how much power and money you have, you can sort of, help control those rules. That was the reason to make the film. And it sort of hasn't always been the takeaway from the film, but I think it basically, if we're talking about saving capitalism, we're talking about saving an economic system so that it works for more people better, which I think somewhat overlaps with your interest on the Transparency Task Force. So that's my opening, kind of, salvo,
right.
And, with it what you want.
Great. That's really, really interesting. We'll go to Tom in just a second. I sometimes wonder about how well, inverted commas, the system understands language, because words like global warming sound so nice and friendly and soft and positive, don't they? Global warming. And I've never, ever thought about the point you just made before, Jacob. And in fact, I didn't think about it when I was watching the documentary. But the very term free market conjures up this wonderfully polite and civilized and, libertarian kind of system, when in fact, the real point you're making is it's not that at all. It's a bit of an illusion. It's smoke and mirrors. Thanks so much, Jacob. Great stuff. Mr. Tom Levitt, what, go on, Jacob, go on.
Just one other thing. In America, I grew up poor, but feeling as though the economy was like the weather, like it just happened to me, like no, I didn't have any control over the economy. And my journey personally was like, the economy isn't the weather. It's actually like constructed system that sort of we all put, we have to plug in, all the rules that architect it. And I think that sense of agency, what you just described, the sense of like global warming, is like we have no agency over the weather, or we don't feel as though we do. If you're, global warming is what conjured this comment back. And of course we have agency over it. We're all constructing a system that is, like meant to have incentivize risk and, reward whatever we want it to reward. And, anyway, there's my follow-up, and then I'll put myself on mute now.
Thanks, Jacob. It's really great to have you with us. Mr. Tom Levitt, over to you, sir.
Well, as the person who I think suggested this film as the topic in the first place, and who this weekend watched it again and actually liked it even more the second time, I feel a sense of responsibility and a bit of awe. I wasn't expecting Jacob to be here, but anyway, let me carry on. Yeah, I think what I really liked about it from a personal point of view was that I actually understand the journey that Robert Reich has been on. I came from a position of being politically very skeptical of business, found myself in government, and now work to try and squeeze what power for good that we can get out of business. And I think there is an appetite within business for doing that. And it's all about the toolbox. Capitalism to me is a toolbox. The question is, who's got their key for the lock for the toolbox? And how do you then use the tools within it for creating what it is that you want? But I also felt, and this is the second most important point, I also felt that the film demonstrated very strongly the difference between the American system and what's happening in Britain. I mean, the figures you quoted, Andy, I knew you were going to pick them up, I could just tell. But absolutely right, but it really does not reflect the situation that happens here in Britain. It is, I think, however, a parable. It's how we could have gone. It's how we might still go. And I was in government at the time of the crash, and the crash caused some great changes in the British economy, shifting it very much towards where that situation is in America, where you've got, in America, I think the figure Robert Reich quoted was 120 or 150 times is what a CEO earns compared to a person on a normal salary. Well, today in America, that figure is 400, but it's still less than 100 in this country. So the divisions are not as great. And I think that, just to make another couple of points, if I may, the other things that changed with the crash, dividends continued to go up, CEO salaries continued to go up, productivity flatlined, the work against poverty flatlined, and actually the average working person's pay went down after the crash. So that very similar pattern happened in America. But I think that what you are hearing in America from the American situation we've seen is not deregulation. I have another word for deregulation. It's called anarchy. And I thought Robert Reich pointed out very, very well that even Adam Smith was not in favor of anarchy. He was in favor of the good regulation of business 250 years ago, not the zero regulation of business. So lots of great parallels, but also some contrasts and a parable. That's where we don't want to go, is what we've been hearing about in that film this weekend.
Wonderful input, Tom. Thank you very much. Do you think, I mean, you've made the point, Tom, that we're not as bad as the States, and I get that, but do you think we're going in the same direction as the States? Is it essentially a time lag difference between us and the States? Because I feel we're going in that direction. I think, forgive me if I sound pessimistic, but I think things are getting gradually worse. I think trust levels are getting worse. I think those numbers, that's our future, I reckon, unless something significant changes.
I think you're right, and you're very, very right to wave a warning flag about it. As I say, the gaps between the rich and the poor, the issues of growing poverty and so on, and that feeling of helplessness, and without wanting to divert the argument, I think the vote on Brexit was a vote about expressing helplessness. It was people saying, we'll vote against something. And I think when a democracy is based on people voting against things, it's very dangerous because you never know what the outcome is going to be. A healthy democracy is where people vote for things, not against things. Yeah, I mean, give you one example. That figure of $5.9 million per year per congressman on lobbying. There's nothing like that in this country. I was an MP for 13 years. I got 3 tickets to a test match, 1 ticket to Wimbledon, and a long weekend in South Africa. That was what I got. That's not $5.9 million a year, but they were, things I worked with businesses, and I had to declare them, and they're all on the public record.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much. Great to have your former politician's perspective on all of this as well. Let's go to Kim.
Hi, Jacob. And you weren't here when I introduced myself, and I guess I didn't mention that I used to live in the US, and I've been living here in the UK now for the last 11 or 12 years. And it's interesting because I kind of see it a little bit in between Tom and Andy. It really concerns me about the tax increase that the UK just passed. And I will say this, I can't vote here because I don't hold a passport, because I got my indefinite leave to remain a week after the Brexit vote and decided that I couldn't see the point of going through, holding a British passport at that point. But I am concerned about the tax increase that the UK government just voted in, because I see the care system as being extremely different than in the US. And some may say that the US care system is broken, but the fact that here care is paid for, and we look around at our carers, and that inequality of people being able to live, and the richest people in this country I see getting bigger and bigger. And maybe it's just a perception, and maybe I have the concerns too, is that we've just gone through Brexit, and we have a shortage of workers everywhere, and we will continue to have that. That's not to say the US doesn't have a shortage of workers too, because they do, but I see that we may fall into a much bigger problem than the US ultimately.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much. Again, it's great to have your both sides of the Atlantic perspective on this as well. Let's go to Nigel. Nigel, have you watched it, and what did you think if you have?
No, I haven't watched it yet, but I do have some comments. I think this element of despair and disconnect that's coming through very strongly from so many people is continuing to have, and will have a greater effect generally. We've had Tom expressing this is why we got Brexit as a protest vote, and perhaps for the same reason over the pond, that's why you got Trump, partially as a protest vote. Sure. People feeling disconnected with political parties generally, and just hearing the mantra of drain the swamp. And very simple sound bites that gave people the idea that there was an escape from the trap that they were in. And I agree very much with what Andy was saying earlier on, that I think we are just behind the States in terms of things getting worse. I would disagree with Andy saying that they're getting gradually worse. I think they're getting rapidly worse. And I think we're rapidly entering into economic mayhem that's going to exacerbate that still further. I heard an expression, I can't remember exactly where it was. I think actually it was on the Kaiser report, but in what context, I can't remember. I think it was Stacey Herbert that was referring to the metropolitan elite. And that interested me because it suddenly occurred to me that the average person knew what she meant by the metropolitan elite. Wherever they come from, whether they're politicians, bankers, they're a very small group of people that hold all the money and all the power. And that just happened to be a label that encapsulated those people. But I think that highlighted to me the acceptance that, so many people have now, that there's a very small number of people in power and with the money controlling everything, and everybody else is getting ripped off, basically.
That's definitely where I'm going with my thoughts, to be honest with you. And they say that you eventually start sounding like your mum or your dad. Hi, Barry. Eventually you start sounding like your mum or your dad. And I am absolutely sure that people don't resign these days when years ago they would have done, had the same thing happen. There are politicians who do stuff today that can just kind of almost walk through the short-term sandstorm that hits them because they've done this or they've done that. Whereas once upon a time, people resigned. People said, that's it, I'm out of here. And they were expected to resign. So one wonders about the extent to which the kind of decay of general societal standards is at the root of this. There's almost like, it almost sometimes seems to me that things that are just totally unacceptable are accepted. There was a bit in the documentary which freaked me out a little bit, actually. It was when Donald Trump was basically saying, he was on some panel question, part of the election. He basically said, the system's broken. I know it's broken because when I'm in business, I pay loads of people loads of money, knowing that when I want a favor from them, I'll get it. I mean, how far away is that to kind of Al Capone type stuff? And I know I'm being a bit dramatic, but how far away is that kind of conduct to the sorts of things that really ought to be completely and utterly despised? It does make me angry. Well, would anybody else like to come in here? In fact, let me invite Barry to briefly introduce himself, and then Alex as well. Barry, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Andy. I'm Barry James. I'm, I guess, a researcher and author these days. I used to be a veteran, 40 years at the forefront of tech, thinking about society and tech, but I seem to be a researcher, author, and activist these days. And yes, it's changed immensely, hasn't it? And I think the really important part of this is that we made it acceptable. And it started, I think, from our researchers about 50 years ago. We made it acceptable for any behavior was profitable. We don't have an effective way of policing. We were talking the other day about regulation and how it's failing, and how it's also captured. And that's not accidental, that's so on. But we do as a society, and we need to stop doing this, please, society. But we need to think about this. We need to stop giving permission to those people who refuse to resign when they get caught, but also to the people who are doing it and lionizing people who do it, whether they get away with it or not.
Yeah, but does it come down to power, Barry? I mean, is it not a case of we can't make them resign, so why would they? If Priti Patel does X and Boris Johnson says we're going to defend her, we're going to put the wagons round her, what can we do about it? I mean, they've got all the power.
Well, the difference between now and literally 1970, right, was that if and it's a progressive from there when you kind of look at the data and look at what happened, was basically, you think about your bank manager, you think about anyone in a position of authority, they were expected to have a certain amount of integrity. And if they didn't, then there were the consequences were, first of all, social. And actually, there's a fantastic piece of research that was it's alluded to it in this book. It's not in this book, but it's alluded to, where the investigation was what sanctions actually work. And the sanctions back then on let's say a bank manager, we'll start with a bank manager, where if he was found to be doing anything dodgy, his peers would make it clear to him that this wasn't acceptable. And now at the end of the 60s, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. We got rid of religion and we got rid of traditional morality, and we said, what should we replace that with? Squirrel. And we never answered that question. And in place of that, we got, profit is king. Financialization.
The primacy of profit. And one of the worrying things I pick up is that when I speak to people in the States and they talk about what's being taught in Harvard and Stanford and all the rest of it, a lot of the business colleges are still pumping out a kind of Friedmanite, profit at all costs agenda. And this is all kind of seeped into the very fabric of the system. So we end up with this kind of intergenerational cascading of the same belief that all that really matters is how much money you make. It's rather worrying. Yes, Mr. Levitt, thank you.
So many things I just want to come back on. Let me pick up on that one. I mean, you're talking about the Chicago School of the business thought and economics, and that goes back 100 years. We didn't really have business schools in this country until Harold Wilson invented them or invested in them. Right. I just completed part of a co-author a report on business schools and the public good, which was published in June, asking how can business schools better help business be a force for good. And that got a very good reception from business schools. But our research certainly showed that, that there is the vestiges of that. What's public good got to do with us still in our business schools? If I could just comment on one or two other things people have said. Barry, without getting in the world of party politics again, when someone has been sacked from a job twice for lying, sacked from a marriage twice for lying, and then gets made prime minister, they're sort of given a clean sheet, and that is rather worrying, and we can only blame the British people for that, really. But Kim, your point about the care system is really interesting. If you look at who owns the care system and look at where the problems have been historically in the British care system, essentially there are three people who own care homes. One is the public sector, very much underfunded, very low pay, well, it's low pay throughout the whole sector. One is that the private stroke family sector, and they are the ones who sort of keep fighting on whatever the odds. But if you look at where the real scare stories in the care homes have been, and the care homes that close overnight and literally push people out on the street, and there was one called Southern Cross about 15 years ago, that was a really good example of that. They are the ones owned by private equity. And it's that high finance world that doesn't think about the social consequences of what it's doing, that prioritizes private above everything, that is, I think, behind a lot of the danger of the mayhem which Nigel talked about. That was the word he used. And whilst I think that politicians in this country are not as powerful as you think they are. I mean, Robert Reich expressed the frustration of being in politics and being at the top in politics and not being able to deliver. And I understand that feeling most definitely. Nevertheless, I still think that it is a minority in business who are the problem. They're probably more in the world of finance than they are in the rest of the world of business. But we need, go back to that phrase again, good regulation of how business operates in order to make sure that everybody benefits, not just the favoured few.
I think you make a really interesting point. So this is Violation Tracker. It's the US database I go on all the time about. We're bringing it to the UK. It's basically a record of the amount of fines against different industries and different companies. If you click on industry totals, financial services is particularly nasty. Yeah, financial services, $332 billion worth of fines since the year 2000. It's a huge company figure. I think it's bigger than some countries' GDP, massive. And if you compare that to all the others, the way it works out is that all of these other industries, I mean, look how far behind pharmaceuticals is, and they're no angels. Pharmaceuticals, 56 billion, oil and gas. Think of all those oil spillages, 44 billion. They're a long, long way behind financial services. In fact, the way the numbers work out is if you add up all the other industries, they roughly equate to financial services. Yeah, roughly half of all the infringements. So I would argue there is something definitely dodgy going on in the financial industry. And I think that speaks to the point you just made, Tom. I think it's the high finance where there seems to be a complete disconnect between morals and integrity. And frankly, it's the whole kind of thing about the bankers being rather predatory with their mindset. You know, they've got a very predatory mindset. And you talking about regulation, when you look at the data, what the data says is the same banks get caught doing the same stuff over and over again. They get fined, but they make so much money from doing the bad stuff that they carry on doing it. I mean, the data is pretty unequivocal. It's there to be seen. So these are big problems. I'm going to invite Alex Varley-Winter to introduce herself. And Alex, please don't forget to mention to Jacob about your burgeoning career as a film producer.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I've just started an MA in filmmaking at Raindance. So I'm focused on documentary making, and yeah, at the moment I'm trying to narrow down to specifically which film I'm working on for my MA, because I've got 4 different ideas at the moment. So yeah, been working on that most of today.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Alex. Have you seen the film yet?
I haven't had a chance to, because my daughter tends to watch the stuff on Netflix, so I'm going to wait till she goes to bed.
Hey, give it a watch. Lovely, lovely. I saw Barry James put his hand up. Barry, if you can concisely make your point, then we'll invite Cliff Southcombe to introduce himself. He's just joined, and then we'll go to any other comments from anybody else. Barry, over to you.
It's just a very brief comment. I've spent years around regulation and looking at it. The question is this: there's no doubt that regulation is an arms race, right? Given that we, instead of trying to use law, which is more powerful, we shovel more and more problems into the regulation bucket and expect the regulators to do it. But we know it's an arms race. How can it be made to work? I think I think we're being over optimistic if we think it can do things that actually it can't do.
Let me share my thought about this. So I think, let me tell you how I see it. I think it's a bit like this. You walk into your kitchen and you see a puddle of water on the floor, and you say to yourself, puddle of water on the floor, don't want that. I know, I'll go and get my buckets and mop and I'll mop it up. And you do, and that gets rid of the puddle of water. And then a day later you go back into your kitchen and lo and behold, there's another puddle of water on the floor. So you get your bucket and you do exactly the same thing. And the point I'm making is that so many of the problems we have are actually symptoms of other causes. And what we really need to do is get to the root causes, the causal factors, the apex issues that actually drive all the other stuff that's wrong. And I would argue, and Jacob's film does this really well, we've basically got a completely skewed democracy. We have a democracy that's out of touch with what society actually needs it to be. We've got a democracy whereby the interests of the majority are not heard. There's a bit in the film where it gives you those stats. Jacob touched on it earlier. I think it concluded that if hardly anybody wanted something to happen in terms of new laws, roughly 30% of the chance it would happen. If practically everybody wanted it, it's also practically 30%. So there's no real democracy there. There's no real democracy there. And because of that, we end up with dynamics like this. We end up with right of centre governments who are funded by banks who have an agenda to maintain the status quo. And we end up with this horrible, horrible vicious circle. I think it's that kind of poison system that we've got that we want to try and break out of. Nigel, thanks for unmuting yourself. Over to you. And then we'll go to Robert.
Thank you. Actually, I was just trying to alert you to the fact that Robert had been waving frantically, and I wanted you to go to him first. So,
okay.
Well, thank you, dear Nigel. First of all, I wanted to apologize. My camera is intermittent and it doesn't work, and raising my hand seems to go off as soon as it goes on. So something wrong with my Zoom. Unfortunately, my email, my online died for a while, so I didn't hear everything that's been said. I'm going to have a session on Wednesday, so I don't need to take a lot of time. But I did want to say, following up Andy's comment, that there are some more basic underlying causes that Robert Reich, I hate to say this, doesn't understand, and that most people do not understand. Almost all of the ideas here are understood by at least millions of people. Now, unfortunately, it's not billions, but I would be surprised if there's any fundamental idea. I mean, in the sense that force equals mass times acceleration, something big and deep. There's probably nothing that's been said today that is understood by, let's say, less than 10,000 people. And what I'm going to offer on Wednesday is that, and I don't want to take up the time, but I would be happy toward the end of this or at some time during this thing to at least give you an idea of what that, there's a missing principle in economic analysis, starting with Adam Smith, going all the way up to the present economic advisors and Nobel Prize. There's a missing principle that is as important as force equals mass times acceleration. And that's what I would like to teach people. It can't be done in an hour.
Oh, I think Robert's connections is...
but it can be done. And if you want me to go on now or toward the end of this, I'm happy to do it. But it would be a complete diversion.
It would be.
What you're talking about now. It would be.
I know.
I have to acknowledge that.
Let's save all that for Wednesday. If you'd like to know more about Robert Ashford's Inclusive Capitalism, then use the link I put in the chat earlier. Get yourself booked on. It's all complimentary, and enjoy yourselves. We'll go to Jacob, then we'll go back to Nigel. Jacob, yes, sir.
I just want to say I have to go, but it was thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and it's great. I mean, it makes me happy to have made something that can have a life past making it, and in a little edit room. So this is wonderful. Thank you for what you're doing. I appreciate all the efforts around transparency. And if I have one more question to throw out to the group, at least in America, to my American ears, the terms freedom on the one side and regulation on the other side, one sounds, as a message creator, one sounds so good. The freedom stuff sounds so good, and regulation sounds so bad. And just as a, I wish that there was a way to frame it in terms of like whose freedom and how we architect a system in a kind of more, I wish there was a way to kind of zoom out and change that discussion a little bit, at least to my ears. I don't exactly know the answer yet, but I feel like that's something I think about from time to time and have thought about a little bit as I've heard you guys chatting here. But anyway, thank you so much for doing this. I got to run. Thanks for watching the film.
Jacob, just before we go, we'd like to thank you, A, for making the film. We've all enjoyed that, those who've had a chance to watch it, and B, for being with us tonight. Can we please show our appreciation to Jacob? Thank you very much indeed. Follow up, Jacob. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye. We'll go to Nigel, then we'll go to Gareth Stears. Nigel.
Well, I was going to ask Jacob a question actually, but I just missed that one. But perhaps I can ask the same question, and anybody can perhaps come in on it.
I'm still here, real quick. If you.
Right. Thank you very much, Jacob. What I was going to say is my concept of capitalism very recently has become very confused as I'm perhaps learning a little bit more and hearing different people's views. So what I'm learning or perhaps appreciating is that capitalism today is not the same type of capitalism that maybe existed globally 20, 30 more years ago. And we have a sort of more debt-orientated financial capitalism that sort of inveigled its way into everybody's lives, as opposed to the industrial manufacturing capitalism that perhaps we had post-war. And I'm just very interested to hear, how we should be thinking about this definition of capitalism.
Well, I think that was always the question I got when making the film is part of the audience would say capitalism is perfect. Why would you want to save it? And the other part would say capitalism is the worst thing that's happened to society. And it sort of depends on what you think capitalism is or what definition you bring to the discussion. So I think that ism is sort of tricky, right? Socialism in America has a terrible connotation for a lot of people who hear it, but nobody can define it for you. This capitalism, people just bring so much to the words that in fact, it's sort of become like any of these other isms when you just sort of react, right? You have this kind of, internal kind of negative or positive reaction, depending on what it is. So this thing of like, what is the economic system generally, and who do the rules benefit and who do they hurt? And do we have transparency to them? I wish that there was a way to have that discussion outside of the isms. Within the film, when I was reading the initial text for this and thinking about it, there was any economic system, this is how I defined it and how we defined it somewhat in the film, but it might have slid by you, is built on certain rules around property, monopoly, contract, bankruptcy, and enforcement, these 5 areas. And you broadly speaking define the system. This is your free market, has rules defining this. You can't have that without rules around contract. You can't have, and this question of enforcement, you just brought up very clearly, Andy, this question of like, if the rules don't have enough teeth so that the economic penalty has a consequence for the companies, they just keep violating the rules. There's no like real consequence against that. So if the system that you have doesn't have good rules around those 5 things, or who those rules benefit and who they hurt and how you can game them as a business, that defines how people's behavior, right? Those are the incentives and negatives. And you have to step outside of the term of capitalism to kind of really have that discussion, because everybody thinks they love capitalism or they hate capitalism, or they love socialism and they hate socialism. And you have to define like, what are the rules making up the system outside of that ism, and who do they benefit and who do they hurt? I think the broad story that we have seen as far as that system is that in the 60s, or this previous period, they benefited a different group of people in a different way than they are functioning right now. And you have to say, like, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing, and have a discussion there. And that's the only way to get past people's, knee-jerk positive and negative reactions to the words anyway. So my 2 cents, I'm sorry to, chime in and run, but thank you again for inviting me, Andy. This has been really enlightening discussion and
very helpful, Jacob. Thank you. Very helpful.
Thanks, Jacob. We'll see you another time, hopefully. Thank you very much. Let's go to Gareth Samra.
Well, I was hoping that Jacob would still be here as well. Having watched the Corporation and then Jacob's film, it seems to me that a lot of these problems began when the corporations adopted the law that was designed to protect the slaves, and corporations then have got more rights now than the human person.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the downfall began, is giving those rights. And in Jacob's film, there was a clip there where I think it was Senator John McCain said that about the Supreme Court ruling that the corporations could maintain this power, and he said basically that they've just written the election or whatever it was. So I think to fix things, what we need to do is stop having the corporations having a higher status than the human being, because that's what they have now. You know,
I think
the bankruptcy laws, etc., in America don't allow somebody to protect their own assets by declaring bankruptcy and having the Chapter 11 process, etc. But corporations can do that.
Yeah.
So, and if I've been to court lots of times, sat in on other members' cases, etc., and my own cases, and it seems that it doesn't matter what you say, whether the bank treated you fairly, didn't treat you, right, did things. At the end of the day, their barrister will say, well, the bank's entitled to make a profit.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what they do to you, they're entitled to make a profit, and the judge goes with that.
There's like an asymmetry of power, isn't there? I get your point in completely.
Yeah, so the right of the corporation or the bank to make a profit far outweighs your rights as a human being to work all your life and then, you know, try and keep your assets where the bank wants to take everything off you at the end of your working life.
I understand. Thank you. And you've got a very bitter personal experience having lived through that. I noticed Gareth put his hand up. Gareth, to you, sir. We'll be wrapping up in a couple of minutes, guys. So we'll go around for any other business in just a moment, and I'll invite Cliff to introduce himself so everybody knows who Cliff is as well. But let's go to Gareth, because I saw Gareth put his hand up earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Just had a couple of thoughts. The first was a theme that's sort of clearly come out of this is you know, trust in the system and in government. And it occurred to me that this is a particularly interesting time to be having this discussion, because I think when there is something like a global pandemic, really brings into sharp relief, you know, why it's important to have a system and a government that you can trust, because I think arguably you can't sort of fight a pandemic on your own. You need a society that's working well to deal with something like this. And it's sort of really bad timing that this would come out when trust in government is especially low. I mean, I think particularly in America, but also here. So that was just sort of one thought I had. One thing I thought when watching the film, sort of towards the end, it tried to leave you with some hope for the future. And when I sort of try and make myself sort of hopeful and sort of remind myself not to get too despondent, I think, well, often, you know, there's sort of ebbs and flows. And I've studied a little bit of the history of the 1970s when I was doing my film degree. And it feels like the 70s is quite a similar time to now, in that trust in government in the US certainly was low because of Watergate. But then, you know, things move on, and, you know, that goes on for a little while. Things seem hopeless, and then things improved. And so I just sort of wonder, and I'm sort of open to the floor in case anyone's got any strong views on this, but, you know, do we think this is a phase and that actually, you know, things will start to reset, or is this the direction of travel? Is trust going to continually erode? Yeah.
What a great question. What a great question. What are people's thoughts about that? Is this a blip, a short-term stage we're going through, a phase, or is this a general direction of travel? Mr. Barry James, great question, Gareth.
I can tell you a pretty clear answer on that based on research. We have runaway inequality, which means it keeps on getting worse. And the gap keeps on widening. That's been the case since 1970. There is no balancing force as things stand. And that started to happen when profit maximization became the whole of the law, as it were. And we haven't got a balancing force for that yet. And the same is true with climate change. We can hope for something from COP26, but is it realistic to hope for a halt? No, and certainly not a turnaround. We're hoping in a situation where, you know, there's a huge amount on the line for millions of people for a bit of a slowdown. So I'm sorry, this doesn't sound like a very hopeful message. I think there is hope. We've got to believe in hope, and we've got to be able to act on it. But for the last 50 years, things did change. They changed for a reason, and Robert's right about that. There are some fundamentals that are not being we're not looking deeply enough. We need to look deeper. We need to find the causes and how to tackle them. And guess what? That's what I'm engaged in and want to do. But the hope doesn't lie in that or in politics. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for a very realistic response. I think Alex wanted to say something. Alex?
Yep. Basically, I think that hope comes in actually sort of representation and what voices get heard. Saw an amazing documentary on Friday night. Got a babysitter and actually went to the cinema, which was great. But Summer of Soul, absolutely beautiful film, and covered the Harlem Culture Festival of 1969. And you see the sort of, it was suppressed at the time, it wasn't shown on TV because it was such an amazing revolutionary soul music festival. And just the level of kind of political engagement at that festival was really striking. A lot of cynicism about the moon landing, people saying, how come they have all this money to send people to the moon and there's so many people that need help, and just the level of cynicism that didn't break through at the time. It's just really interesting to see. Basically what I'm trying to do in my filmmaking is to try and focus on underrepresented voices. What I saw as a journalist, a print journalist over a number of years, is a sort of depressing cynicism towards anyone that has a legal case. Like, if you do a story about someone that's fighting a legal case, you'll be seen as like picking a side, and you'll be seen as biased. So you just kind of don't even go there. There was like this culture of just kind of being very cynical towards anything that was to do with legal battles. And I think that the media has to stop doing that and to actually engage with people who are fighting against incredible odds. So that's
all extremely interesting, Alex. Thank you very much. I want to watch that documentary. I've seen the trailers of it, and I read a little bit about it. Is it good?
You can actually stream it on Hulu, but I would recommend seeing it on a big screen. I thought the performances were going to be good. They were at least 20 times better. It was like, I love going to live music gigs and stuff, and literally it felt like being at 10 of the best gigs I've ever been at. Just amazing. So good. I cried most of the way through it.
Oh, lovely. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Sounds like a modern day opera to go and see. Yeah, it's a bit weird, isn't it? How there was no publicity about what was going on, none. Amazing. We're going to go to Cliff to invite Cliff to briefly introduce himself and share any final thoughts he'd like to. Then we're going to go to Tom, and then we'll probably start wrapping things up. Cliff, please tell us all a bit about you. Nice to see
Andy,
you.
my apologies. I got the time wrong. I thought this was starting at 7 for some reason, so I thought I'd come early and then find that you're wrapping it all up, which is a shame. It sounds it's been a great discussion. Very quickly, I'm from a company called Social Enterprise International, and there are a couple of things which I can do a quick advert for. One is that we've been working a lot with what we call shared wealth social enterprises, and we've been saying to businesses that if you, by and large, if you're not aware of your social impact, you don't have any sort of social purpose, if you've got no values, got no ethics, if you're not democratic, but most of all, if you are not sharing the wealth that you create fairly, then you are part of the problem. And as a result, we've got about nearly 20 companies now all sort of working with us to develop this whole idea of shared wealth, all of them coming largely from what they would have called the private sector rather than the sort of the social economy sector. Anyone going to COP26? We're there with one of our social license holders, Beyond Green. So we've got an event going on in Glasgow. So please contact me for that. And also, anyone who likes gigs, we're planning a road trip which starts next year, starting in the UK, probably ending in Berlin. And it's working with young people because our road trip is about young people setting up enterprises that are shared wealth social enterprises. In other words, they have values, social purpose, democracy, and sharing the wealth. And it's interesting, the discussions we're having, the different types of wealth that companies are creating and the different ways in which they're sharing it. And our roadshow is about basically, as adults, we've buggered up, nearly used a stronger word there. And really the only thing we can do is to give the kids as big a chance to correct the mistakes that we've had, that we've created, create their own future. And the best way of doing that is teaching them to set up business that's proper and business that works. So, quick advert.
Very good, Cliff. Nice to see you. Nice to have you with us.
And you, Andy. Yeah, we don't do enough together, I think. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. Let's fix that. Thank you, Cliff. Yeah. I know Tom wanted to say something. We'll go to Tom, and then we'll probably bring things to a nice natural close. Mr. Levitt, back to you.
I'm going to try and make a few very quick points. Firstly, I'm not against corporate entities having rights, but I am against anyone having rights which are not then balanced by responsibilities. And that's the responsibilities that are getting missing from this equation. Second point, Alex, I don't think it's the cynicism that's a problem. I think it's the post-cynical era we're in. Jeff Bezos standing up there and thanking us for funding him going into space. That's not why I use this, I have to say. And I just thought that was just post-cynical and a terrible thing for him to have said. Third point, Cliff, what you've just been saying is absolute music to my ears. 6 years ago, I set up a social enterprise. And today we help 30,000 people a year out of debt by, we call Fair for You, and we disrupt the high cost credit market. And we provide an ethical alternative to that. We don't call ourselves a not-for-profit because to my mind, there are only two forms of not-for-profits, and that's charities and bankrupts. But we are a social enterprise, a purpose-led business. We haven't made a profit yet, but that doesn't mean we're a not-for-profit. But when we do make that profit, it will be in order to make sure we can provide even better services to our customers. And my final point, Barry, I very much like what you had to say, and about climate in particular. I've been doing some research recently. COP26 is not about governments tackling climate change. Governments don't have an awful lot of direct influence. At the end of the day, it is about A, individual people, and B, businesses, because that's where the bulk of the climate problem comes from. The sheer number of people and the sheer quantity of greenhouse gases produced by business. But I've been doing some work recently, which has been looking at the FTSE 100. And if we look at them and look at the action they are taking, because they realize that climate change is an existential problem for themselves. And if you take the World Economic Forum's year-old now assessment that 40% of all investment globally is now climate sensitive, then actually we have got some good examples there of businesses seeing the problem and using that toolbox that I talked about, those tools that are needed to run business. If you use those businesses for a social purpose, as Cliff was describing, and I pay tribute to those businesses like Waits, for example, who when they're procuring services and goods, they look first to the social enterprise sector and say, who can we purchase these goods and services from? So I'll wind up there, but it's about the toolbox, using the tools that capitalism has built in the last 100, 200 years and using them for good.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. We're going to go to Mr. Gareth Stears, who, as our head of events, head of film club events, has the final word. Gareth, back to you. Any final comments that you'd like to make before I finally wrap up?
I hadn't really planned to. I mean, what I will do is add Inequality for All, the other film by Jacob, to our future watch list.
Excellent, yes.
So maybe he'll come back and talk about that as well, because it was great having him on.
It was, wasn't it?
The only other thought I had, not really a sort of a complete thought, but I thought I wasn't expecting to have sort of a conversation about language, but I think that did come out, and it is interesting, isn't it, how You know, the associations with the words, you know, capitalism and socialism really do sort of stand in the way of having a frank and useful discussion about things like this, and freedom as well, and regulation, and that was something I just wasn't really expecting to come up, but I actually think is probably the thing I'm going to take away most in this session. Actually, yeah, it's very interesting, but also quite frustrating, because I think it's true.
I think it's true as well. I mean, I think in America, the term socialist is used as a kind of derogatory insult, because they've got all that hang up about people being communists and that stuff in the early 70s. I agree. Really interesting point. Barry, keep it really brief.
Yeah, it's just an interesting historical note. I went back and reread the piece that kicked this all off in the mainstream by Milton Friedman in the New York Times in 1970. And if you can go and find it and read it, it's McCarthyite in tone.
Right. Yeah.
And it accuses anyone who disagrees with the primacy of profit, and that not just primacy, but the monopoly of profit, basically of being a downright socialist. So it's like Pinko's stuff. So that kind of helps explain some of the things we've been talking about. I hope that helps. It
does help. It's another really interesting point. What a wonderful conversation we've had, folks. So thank you all very much indeed for participating. We'll get this out on social media so that those who weren't able to join us can at least hear it and watch it if they want to. This week we've got Wednesday for Robert's session on inclusive capitalism. I'll put the link into the chat. On Thursday, we've got the session all about culture audit in the financial services sector, a book by Roger Miles, or Dr. Roger Miles. So we've got quite a bit happening this week. We'll wrap it up there, folks. Thank you very much indeed. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.